Please subscribe to my channel. This is my sincere request to you. My brother allowed me at his engagement dinner on one condition. I must not call him brother in front of her family. It is not because I am unemployed or hiding dirty secrets. It is because her father is a United States Senator. He fears my voice will destroy his empire of greed and lies. I am not the most powerful person there, but I alone know who is selling out our family and losing everything. My name is Quinn Castillo. I am 36 years old. The neon glow from the street lamp outside my Arlington apartment filtered through the window blinds. It cast long and sharp shadows across my small dining table. I was sitting completely alone. I felt utterly exhausted. I was eating a cold meal of leftover noodles after pulling a 14-hour shift at Calder-Rowan Advisory. My job as a senior financial investigator meant my days were spent untangling complex webs of shell companies. I tracked dirty money across international borders. I exposed wealthy people who thought they were smart enough to hide their greed from the authorities. I lived my life in a world of hidden numbers, offshore bank accounts, and corporate lies. It was a cynical way to make a living, but it paid the bills and kept my mind incredibly sharp. I took another slow bite of my dinner. I stared blankly at the beige wall of my apartment, feeling grateful for the absolute silence. Then my mobile phone rang loudly. The bright screen lit up the dark room with a name I rarely saw outside of obligatory holiday messages. Owen Castillo, my brother. We did not speak often. We lived completely different lives. Owen existed in a world of tailored designer suits, high-end networking events, and ruthless ambition. When I answered the call, his voice lacked the usual rushed and dismissive tone he usually reserved for me. Instead, his voice sounded smooth. It sounded practiced and carefully controlled. He sounded exactly like a salesman pitching a high-stakes proposal. He told me he was getting engaged. The woman was Charlotte Mercer. Even I, someone who actively avoided the political circus of Washington, knew that exact name. She was the daughter of Adrian Mercer. He was a very powerful United States Senator. Owen spoke her name with a deep reverence that disgusted me instantly. I was not jealous. I was disgusted because I knew he was in love with her political pedigree far more than he was in love with the actual person. He announced proudly that there would be an intimate dinner on Saturday evening to celebrate the occasion. It was an exclusive gathering, he said, meant only for family and the most important people in his and Charlotte's inner circle. For a fleeting and foolish second, I felt a genuine sense of surprise. I actually thought my older brother was reaching out to include me in a major milestone of his life. I thought that despite our massive differences in lifestyle, he still wanted his younger sister at his engagement dinner. I'd opened my mouth to congratulate him properly, but Owen did not pause to let me speak a single word. He smoothly transitioned into the real reason for his unexpected call. He told me I was officially invited to attend, but there was a strict condition. It was a single and non-negotiable rule. I could come to the expensive dinner, I could eat the gourmet food, and I could sit in the room, but I was absolutely forbidden from introducing myself as his sister. If anyone at the party asked about me, I was instructed to smile politely and say I was simply an old family acquaintance. Nothing more than that. I stopped chewing my food. A heavy silence stretched between us through the phone line. I asked him to repeat what he had just said. I was desperately hoping my physical exhaustion had caused me to mishear his words. He repeated the sentence perfectly. His voice grew much colder this time, stripping away the polished and polite veneer. He explained that the Mercer family was extremely particular about their public image and reputation. The guest list for Saturday included high political advisors, major campaign donors, and influential socialites from across the state. These were powerful people who demanded absolute perfection from their peers. Owen said they did not need to know the complicated details of our family background. I knew exactly what he meant by complicated details. I was the complication. I was the stubborn woman who wore sensible, flat shoes to work. I worked late nights digging through fraudulent tax returns. I completely refused to play the corporate game of fake smiles and strategic handshakes. I did not possess a massive trust fund. I did not attend Ivy League charity galas. I did not bow down to wealth or unearned status. To Owen, my lack of social pretense was a massive liability to his future. He was about to marry into political royalty. He believed a working-class and blunt financial investigator for a sister would tarnish his carefully constructed image of a self-made elite businessman. A heavy and sickening feeling settled deep in my stomach. It was not just a rude insult. It was a complete and utter eraser of my existence in his life. I was being treated exactly like a dirty family secret he had to sweep under the rug before the important guests arrived at the mansion. I told him he was out of his mind if he thought I would ever agree to such a humiliating charade. I told him to have a wonderful dinner and that I would absolutely not be attending under any circumstances. That was the exact moment when Owen played his final trump card. He let out a soft and condescending sigh. He told me not to make a dramatic scene. He said I was always acting too emotional over business decisions. And then he dropped the piece of information that truly broke whatever fragile bond our family had left. He told me that our parents already knew about the arrangement. They knew about the cruel condition, and they had agreed to it completely. In fact, he said they genuinely believed it was for the greater good of his future career. The air completely left my lungs. My own mother and father, the two people who raised us in a modest and hard-working home, they had agreed to let their golden son hide their only daughter. They had consciously chosen his blind ambition over my basic dignity. They were perfectly willing to sit at a table full of wealthy strangers and pretend they only had one child, all to ensure Owen secured his rightful place among the rich and powerful elites. The sting of his words was not a sharp or sudden pain. It was a slow and agonizing ache that spread rapidly through my chest. It was the crushing realization that in my family, love was purely transactional, and I had clearly depreciated in value to zero. I tightly gripped the edge of my dining table. The urge to scream at him loudly, to curse him out and block his phone number forever was overwhelming. I wanted to cut all family ties immediately and leave them to their pathetic social climbing games. But then the analytical part of my brain suddenly snapped to attention. The specific part of my mind that tracked hidden corporate assets and exposed major financial fraud for a living started working. Something about this situation did not add up correctly. My mind drifted back to a specific event from 3 weeks ago. Owen had sent me a thick envelope of legal documents via Priority Express mail. They were official papers regarding a small commercial lot of land in Prince George County that our grandmother, Marisol Castillo, had left to both of us equally in her will. The area was entirely unremarkable for many years, but recently, quiet whispers of a massive regional development project had driven local property values through the roof. Owen had called me repeatedly back then, urging me to sign the documents as quickly as possible. He claimed he had found a highly reliable corporate buyer and that we needed to liquidate the asset immediately to avoid upcoming heavy tax burdens. I had not signed those papers. When I briefly reviewed the pages, I noticed several glaring red flags immediately. The corporate entity listed as the buyer was a newly formed limited liability company with a highly obscure ownership structure. The property valuation seemed deliberately deflated by at least 40%. It looked exactly like a classic shell game. It was the exact kind of illegal setup I investigated every single day at Calder Rowan Advisory. I had tossed the papers on my desk, fully intending to run a deep background check on the buyer when I had free time. Then I simply got too busy with my own casework to follow up on it. Now sitting in the dark apartment and connecting the dots, a chilling clarity washed all over me. Owen was absolutely terrified of me opening my mouth at that dinner party. But he was not just afraid of me embarrassing him in front of high society with my lack of manners. My lack of refinement was merely a convenient excuse. If I proudly introduced myself as his sister, Charlotte Mercer and her highly powerful father would immediately know I existed. They would know I was part of his immediate family circle. And if they knew I existed, they might easily discover that I was the equal co-owner of a piece of land that Owen was desperately trying to control without my knowledge. My older brother was not just a terrible snob. He was a criminal fraud. He was actively hiding something massive. He was hiding something deeply tied to that specific land and these new powerful political connections. and my parents, who were blindly loyal to his financial success, were either unwittingly complicit in his scheme or actively helping him silence me so the deal would go through smoothly. The profound humiliation I felt only a few moments ago began to harden instantly into something entirely different. It turned into a cold and highly calculated focus. It was the exact kind of professional focus I used when I found a massive discrepancy in a corrupt millionaire's private ledger. I took a very deep breath. I smoothed my voice out until it was as flat and completely devoid of emotion as his voice was. I told Owen I'd understood his position perfectly. I told him I saw his point about the Mercer family and their strict need for a pristine political environment. I agreed to his terms without any further argument. I promised I would dress appropriately, sit exactly where I was told to sit, and introduce myself solely as an old family acquaintance. I promised I would not do a single thing to ruin his perfect evening. Owen sounded incredibly relieved on the other end of the line. He praised me for finally being a reasonable adult and promised to text me the exact address and the strict dress code immediately. He hung up the phone quickly, likely believing he had successfully managed a very difficult public relations situation. I slowly set my phone face down on the wooden table. The cold takeout food sat forgotten in front of me. I was no longer a discarded younger sister mourning a broken family bond. I was a professional financial investigator who had just been handed a loose thread. I was going to pull that thread until my brother's entire fabricated life unraveled right in front of his new and powerful audience. I would attend his engagement dinner on Saturday. I would flawlessly play the role of the quiet and distant acquaintance, and I would watch his every single move like a hawk. Growing up in our working-class Hispanic household in a cramped suburban neighborhood, the unspoken rules of our existence were established early and enforced daily with suffocating consistency. My brother was the golden child. He was the undeniable pride of the Castillo family. When my parents looked at him, they did not just see a son. They saw a boy who intuitively knew how to walk into large and important rooms and demand that people listen to him. He possessed the natural charm, the upright posture, and the easy, confident smile of someone who belonged to a much higher tax bracket than we could ever afford. I was the exact opposite. I was the one who stayed behind in the shadows to sweep up the mess. If he made a mistake, if he broke a rule or overstepped a boundary, I was the one tasked with figuring out how to fix it quietly. I absorbed the blame and managed the fallout. So his upward trajectory remained completely uninterrupted. My father, Victor Castillo, was not a malicious man by nature. He worked incredibly hard his entire life, breaking his back at labor-intensive jobs to keep food on our table, but he was fundamentally weak in spirit. He possessed a deep-seated and paralyzing fear of conflict. Whenever tension filled the small and poorly ventilated rooms of our childhood home, my father would simply fade into the background like a ghost. He chose absolute silence every single time a difficult conversation arose. He preferred to let grievances fester and rot rather than risk a loud argument that might disturb his fragile peace. My mother Elena operated on a completely different frequency. Her love was fiercely pragmatic. It was a highly calculated investment strategy rather than a source of unconditional warmth. She did not withhold affection out of deliberate cruelty, but she naturally and instinctively gravitated toward the child who represented a brighter and more secure financial future. She poured her boundless energy, her meager savings, and her fierce loyalty into his relentless ambitions. She viewed him as our collective ticket out of a life defined by constant struggle and mediocrity. When our grandmother Maris Salal Castillo passed away a few years ago, she left us the only asset of real tangible value our family had ever owned in generations. It was a small commercial lot situated in Prince George County. On the surface, it looked like a forgettable patch of dirt, overgrown weeds, and cracked asphalt next to an old strip mall. But the economic landscape of the surrounding area was shifting rapidly. A massive regional development project was quietly being approved by local government officials, and that unremarkable plot of land was suddenly sitting directly in the center of a very lucrative expansion zone. I was the only person in our entire family who actually took the time to sit down and read the fine print of her final, will, and testament. I spent countless hours late at night analyzing the property taxes, the municipal zoning laws, and the highly complex ownership rights attached to the deed. I ran the financial numbers meticulously. I realized with absolute certainty that if we held onto the land and sold it properly to the right commercial developer at the exact peak of the real estate market, the resulting profits would completely secure a highly comfortable retirement for my parents. They would never have to worry about missing a single mortgage payment or taking on additional crippling debt for the rest of their natural lives. It was their salvation wrapped in a strict legal document. But my brother did not see a safety net or a retirement fund for our aging parents. He looked at the hard-earned legacy of our grandmother and saw nothing but a poker chip. He saw immediate leverage. To him, that piece of earth was his exclusive ticket to pull up a chair at the wealthiest and most exclusive tables in the city. For several months, he had been subtly and then aggressively pushing for a rapid liquidation of the asset. He kept pitching the idea of selling it off quickly to what he vaguely called a clean and highly respectable group of private investors. He promised a fast cash payout, deliberately ignoring the massive long-term value we would be sacrificing. He wanted the capital right now to fuel his own elite charade. He thought he could easily manipulate the situation because he vastly underestimated me for years. He never bothered to ask what I actually did for a living on a daily basis. To him, I was just a bitter girl with a boring desk job who pushed papers around all day. He had absolutely no idea that my entire career was built on dismantling the exact kind of shady corporate structures he was trying to use against his own blood. He did not know that I spent my days tracking dirty money funneling through municipal reconstruction funds. He did not know I tore apart massive public and private partnership projects that were nothing more than empty corporate shells designed to hide illicit wealth and political favors. He assumed my silence at family gatherings was born from ignorance and jealousy, not from years of sharp analytical observation. The devastating reality of my profound isolation within my own family was cemented late in the evening. The night before the engagement dinner, my mobile phone rang, and this time the caller ID showed it was my mother. She did not call to ask how my week was going or if I was feeling well. She certainly did not call to apologize for the humiliating condition her son had placed upon my attendance. Her voice sounded tight, anxious, and strictly businesslike. She called solely to give me a list of behavioral instructions. She told me to wear something extremely modest and unassuming. She explicitly ordered me to sit exactly where I was placed by the event planners and to keep my mouth firmly shut during the meal. Then she delivered a sentence that cut far deeper than any physical blow ever could. She told me not to let my strong personality embarrass him in front of his new and highly important friends. Listening to her frantic and hushed tones, a freezing cold realization settled deep into my bones. For years, I had made excuses for their behavior. I had repeatedly told myself they were just intimidated by his overwhelming success. I had told myself they were simply tired, working-class people who were easily swayed by his expensive suits and smooth-talking charm. But that brief phone call stripped away all my lingering childhood illusions. They were not merely weak or confused. They were fully complicit in my erasure. They had actively chosen a side in a war I did not even know we were fighting. They had placed my basic human dignity on a scale against his potential social elevation, and they had collectively decided I was an entirely acceptable sacrifice. They were perfectly willing to trade my identity and my voice just to secure his proximity to extreme political power. After the call ended abruptly, I walked into my dimly lit bedroom and pulled a simple black dress from the back of the closet. I slipped the dark fabric over my head and stood completely still before the fold, mirror mounted on the door. The garment was unadorned, conservative, and entirely unremarkable. It was exactly the kind of dress meant to blend seamlessly into the background shadows of a grand ballroom. I stared deeply at my own reflection, tracing the familiar and tired lines of my face. The heavy feeling that washed over me in that quiet room was incredibly old. It was a suffocating ghost resurrected from my childhood. It was not fear. I was far beyond being afraid of these people or their wealthy new connections. Instead, It was the distinct and nauseating sensation of being packaged and prepared by my own flesh and blood. I felt exactly like a defective piece of merchandise. I was an inconvenient item they felt socially obligated to bring along to the showcase. But they desperately needed to hide the manufacturing label. They were absolutely terrified that the wealthy and powerful buyers would see where I truly came from, realize the fraudulent nature of the product, and reject the entire family outright. I slowly smoothed down the dark fabric over my heads, erasing any wrinkles. They wanted me to be a silent shadow. They demanded a ghost. Tomorrow night, I would give them exactly what they asked for, playing the role perfectly until the exact moment I decided to bring their entire world crashing down into the blinding, inescapable light. The drive from my apartment to the prestigious neighborhood of Toke took exactly 45 minutes. Every single mile marked a stark transition from my practical reality to a world of blinding excess. I steered my battered 8-year-old sedan through the towering row iron gates of the Mercer estate. The driveway was paved with immaculate gray cobblestones and flanked by ancient oak trees draped in subtle golden lighting. Ahead of me, a long line of black luxury utility vehicles and sleek European sports cars waited to drop off their passengers. A young valet in a crisp white uniform stepped forward when I pulled up. He opened my car door with practiced efficiency, but I caught the brief hesitation in his eyes. He tried very hard not to let his gaze linger on the scratched paint and the dented bumper of my vehicle. I handed him the keys, grabbed my small clutch purse, and began the long walk toward the imposing grand entrance of the mansion. The air inside the massive foyer was heavy. It smelled of expensive floral arrangements, roasted meats, and the metallic tang of ruthless ambition. The soaring vated ceilings and polished marble floors amplified the low hum of practiced conversations. It took me less than 10 seconds to realize this was not a warm gathering of loved ones. It was a high-stakes political fundraiser carefully disguised as an intimate dinner party. I recognized the faces scattered throughout the room immediately. There were aggressive defense attorneys holding crystal glasses filled with amber liquid. There were heavily funded campaign managers whispering urgently into the ears of wealthy donors. I even spotted 2 prominent local television news anchors laughing loudly near a massive, intricately carved ice sculpture. This was a highly curated stage. Every single guest was a calculated addition, a moving piece on a very expensive chessboard designed to elevate the Mercer political dynasty. My brother intercepted me before I could even reach the coat check counter. Owen stepped out from behind a towering marble pillar, physically blocking my path to the main dining hall. He was wearing a custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo that undoubtedly cost more than I earned in 3 full months. His eyes darted quickly and anxiously from the top of my head down to my sensible black heels. He was performing a rapid clinical risk assessment. He was checking to see if my simple dress and lack of expensive jewelry constituted a visual liability. He exhaled a sharp, audible breath of relief when he saw I looked entirely unremarkable. He stepped dangerously close, forcing me to lean back slightly. He lowered his voice to a harsh, commanding whisper. He reminded me of our strict agreement. He handed me a small, heavy piece of cardstock with a number printed on it in elegant, bold foil. He told me to go straight to my assigned seat and to stay completely out of the camera frames of the hired photographers. He added one final stinging instruction before turning away. He said, if any of the guests bothered to ask what I did for a living, I should simply tell them I worked in basic corporate auditing. He wanted me to sound as boring, tedious, and inconsequential as humanly possible. He wanted to ensure no one asked any follow-up questions. I slipped the heavy seating card into my purse and started walking down the main corridor. Suddenly, a woman stepped gracefully into my path and offered a warm, genuinely welcoming smile. It was Charlotte Mercer. She looked absolutely nothing like the superficial, vapid political Aries I had cynically built up in my mind over the past few weeks. She wore an understated emerald silk gown that perfectly complemented her sharp, intelligent features, but it was her eyes that caught my attention and held it completely. They were dark, incredibly observant, and entirely still. She was not a woman who simply smiled blankly for photographs and nodded at the right intervals. She was a woman who watched the entire room and absorbed every single microscopic detail. She introduced herself politely and thanked me sincerely for coming to the celebration. I offered her a polite nod and delivered my rehearsal line perfectly. I told her I was just an old, distant acquaintance of the Castillo family. Charlotte tilted her head slightly. A flicker of genuine confusion crossed her elegant face. She glanced down at the master seating chart held by an anxious event coordinator standing nearby. She noticed my table assignment number and then looked over at the main VIP section where my parents were currently being seated with glasses of expensive champagne. She asked me gently, her voice laced with genuine curiosity, why I was placed so far away by the rear patio doors while Victor and Alina were seated near the front with the immediate family. I offered a tight, non-committal smile and told her I simply preferred the quiet corners, but I could see the gears turning rapidly behind her dark eyes. Charlotte was far too smart to miss the glaring social discrepancy. She knew instinctively that something was completely wrong with the neat, tidy Owen had painted for her. I excused myself politely and continued navigating through the labyrinth of massive circular tables draped in heavy white silk. The dining room was a sea of calculated laughter and strategic, firm handshakes. As I walked past the secondary tier of VIP seating, my professional instincts suddenly flared to life. A man was holding caught near a private mahogany wood bar. He had thick silver hair, a forced artificial tan, and a wide smile that never quite reached his cold, dead eyes. I knew his face instantly. The sight of him made my stomach drop. It was Silas Kincaid. In my specific line of work, that name was practically synonymous with sophisticated, unchecked corporate greed. Sealers was a notorious regional real estate developer who made tens of millions of dollars by hiding behind elaborate philanthropic shells. He specialized in aggressive urban gentrification disguised as noble community revitalization projects. He routinely bought up distressed properties, forced out low-income residents through brutal legal loopholes, and built massive commercial complexes while simultaneously claiming massive municipal tax breaks for his supposed charity work. Seeing a predator like him standing in the middle of my brother's engagement dinner was the absolute equivalent of hearing a fire alarm go off in a locked windowless building. Silas Kincaid did not attend social events for the free food or the polite conversation. He only showed up when there was a highly lucrative, entirely ruthless deal on the table. My heart began to beat a steady, rhythmic warning against my ribs. I kept my face perfectly blank and kept walking toward my assigned table at the absolute back of the cavernous room. Near the swinging doors leading to the catering kitchen, there was a small polished wooden display stand. It held stacks of glossy promotional brochures detailing the senator's upcoming legislative initiatives. Positioned directly next to the pamphlets was a heavy brass placard thanking the major corporate sponsors who had generously funded the evening's extravagant festivities. I slowed my pace down to a crawl. I let my trained eyes scan the long list of printed names. Most of them were standard political action committees, established lobbying firms, and massive defense contractors. But one specific line of text located near the very bottom of the shiny brass placard made my blood run entirely cold. It was the name of a highly obscure limited liability company. It was the exact same corporate entity listed as the primary buyer on the fraudulent land transfer documents Owen had aggressively mailed to me exactly 3 weeks ago. The very same documents I had stubbornly refused to sign. The disparate pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind with a violent, sickening clarity. Silas Kincaid was the silent, hidden financial backer behind that untraceable shell company. Owen was actively using his brand-new privileged access to the formidable Mercer political machine to fast-track an impossible zoning approval for Kincaid's next development. In exchange for this massive political favor, Kincaid was quietly buying our grandmother's land for absolute pennies on the dollar to serve as the anchor site for his lucrative project. And my own brother was deliberately selling out my rightful inheritance, my family legacy, and my very identity to make the entire corrupt transaction happen smoothly. I finally reached my assigned table located in the darkest, most ignored corner of the room. The other guests seated there barely glanced at me. I pulled out my heavy wooden chair and sat down slowly facing the large glass patio doors. The dark reflection in the window showed a brilliantly lit room full of wealthy predators, powerful politicians, and desperate social climbers. It also showed a quiet, still woman in a plain black dress, who now knew every single one of their filthy secrets. This night was no longer just a cruel, humiliating family betrayal. It was an active, ongoing financial crime scene, and I was the only investigator in the entire room who possessed the power to burn it all to the ground. My assigned seat was at table 44. It was stationed at the absolute fringes of the magnificent dining room. The heavy wooden chair was pushed so far back that my shoulders nearly brushed against the thick velvet drapes covering the rear patio doors. I was not seated with anyone of consequence. The guest list at this specific table was a highly curated collection of social liabilities and forgotten obligations. To my immediate right sat an elderly aunt from the Mercer extended family. She wore a heavy pearl necklace and smelled faintly of lavender and old dust. She spent the first 20 minutes staring blankly at her empty crystal water glass. Across the circular table sat a heavy-set political consultant with a deeply flushed face. He had clearly lost his professional relevance at least 10 years ago, and he was currently compensating for it by aggressively drinking the complimentary imported gin. To my left sat a sharply dressed but bitter woman, who curtly introduced herself as the former managing director of the Mercer Family Charitable Trust. She radiated a quiet, exhausted anger, clearly discarded by the family machinery once her usefulness had expired. We were the island of the unwanted. However, my brother had made a massive tactical error by placing me in this exact spot. From this shadowed corner, the entire ballroom stretched out before me like a brilliantly illuminated stage. I could see every single interaction. I could monitor the shifting body language of the most powerful people in the room, and absolutely no one was paying any attention to me. I was completely invisible to a woman who spent her entire professional life dissecting human deception and unearthing buried truths. This isolated table was not a punishment. It was the perfect hunting blind. About 45 minutes into the evening, the deafening roar of polite conversation provided a thick acoustic cover over the room. I watched as Silas Kincaid detached himself from a group of wealthy defense contractors near the center of the hall. He gestured sharply to a tall, aggressively thin man wearing a charcoal gray suit. The man carried the distinct, highly cautious posture of a corporate defense attorney. Kincaid led the lawyer away from the bright center lights, navigating deliberately toward the quiet, shadowed perimeter of the room. They stopped exactly 4 feet away from my table. They stood with their backs turned toward me, facing the dark glass of the patio doors. They assumed the loud chatter of the room would completely drown out their private conversation. They did not account for the silent woman sitting perfectly still in the dark corner. I stopped breathing and focused entirely on the low growling pitch of Kincaid's voice. He was not talking about philanthropy or community revitalization. He was speaking rapidly and angrily about legal deadlines. Kincaid told the lawyer they needed to lock up the clean ownership of the commercial lot before the engagement dinner concluded. He stressed that the political optics had to be absolutely pristine before Senator Mercer officially endorsed the housing initiative next month. The lawyer murmured something highly technical about probate laws and joint tenancy. Kincaid cut him off with a harsh, dismissive wave of his hand. He lowered his voice to a menacing growl, stating clearly that they absolutely could not let the remaining coheir get in the way of a $50 million development project. He demanded the lawyer ensure the secondary signature was fully authenticated and legally binding by Monday morning. The words hit me like a physical strike to the chest. The remaining coheir, he was talking directly about me. Before I could even process the full legal implications of what I had just overheard, a heavy scent of cheap floral perfume invaded my space. I looked up and saw my mother, Elena, hovering nervously over my shoulder. She had quietly slipped away from the primary VIP table at the front of the room. She did not look at my face. She did not ask if I was enjoying the meal or if I felt comfortable. Her hands were trembling slightly as she leaned down, her mouth positioned right next to my ear. Her voice was nothing more than a desperate, strained whisper. She told me that if I still cared about her and my father even a little bit, I would not do a single thing to ruin this evening. She gripped the back of my wooden chair with white knuckles and told me that this specific business deal was going to save our entire family from total financial ruin. She turned around and hurried back to her prominent seat before I could formulate a single response. She left me sitting alone with the absolute confirmation of my darkest fears. My parents were not just turning a blind eye to my brother's social climbing. They were fully aware that Owen was actively using my half of our grandmother's inheritance as a corrupt bargaining chip to buy his way into the Mercer family infrastructure. Worse than that, my mother and father had staked their entire financial survival on the success of his criminal transaction. They had willingly offered me up as a sacrificial lamb on the altar of his boundless ambition. I slowly shifted my gaze back toward the front of the room. Through the intricate floral centerpieces and the towering crystal wine glasses, I made direct eye contact with Charlotte Mercer. She was seated directly next to my brother, playing the role of the radiant bride perfectly, but her dark, intelligent eyes kept darting past Owen, scanning the long room until they landed squarely on me. She watched the brief, tense interaction between me and my mother. Charlotte was brilliant. She was already calculating the massive emotional distance between the polished fictional family history Owen had sold her and the grim, undeniable reality of the woman banished to the shadows. She recognized that Owen was desperately trying to erase me from the structural foundation of his perfectly curated life. My mind raced back to the conversation Kincaid had just had with his attorney. They had discussed a secondary signature that was already in their possession. They just needed to authenticate it. I carefully reached into my small black purse and retrieved my mobile phone. I kept the device hidden below the edge of the tablecloth, shielding the bright screen with my hand. I opened my professional email application and ran a rapid search query for any digital correspondence sent by my brother over the past 6 months. I bypassed the recent messages and dug into the archived folders. I found an old email thread from exactly 14 months ago. It was a mundane conversation where Owen had asked me to review some standard tax documents for our parents. Attached to that old email was a digital file I had signed and returned to him. I opened the file attachment and zoomed in closely on the electronic signature block. Then, using my specialized investigative software, I extracted the hidden metadata embedded deep within the document. I stared at the glowing screen in the dark corner of the room. The signature on Kincaid's fraudulent land transfer documents was a perfect pixel-for-pixel digital replica of the signature I had used on those old tax forms. But the digital timestamp on the newly created transfer document showed it was officially executed on the 12th day of October. I closed my eyes tightly. On the 12th day of October, I was sitting on a commercial airplane flying over the Atlantic Ocean, traveling to a massive financial fraud conference in London. I had no internet access for 14 straight hours. It was mathematically and physically impossible for me to have signed that document. My brother had forged my signature to steal my land and secure his political alliance. I placed my phone back into my purse and looked at the empty seat beside me. The humiliating truth of the evening finally crystallized into absolute clarity. Table 44 was not just a tool used to lower my self-esteem. It was a calculated physical quarantine. Owen knew that if I sat anywhere near the center of power, I might overhear the wrong conversation. He knew that if I was properly introduced to Silas Kincaid or Senator Mercer as the sister, they would immediately recognize my last name and connect me to the land deal. My brother needed me pushed as far away as possible to ensure I remained completely deaf, blind, and mute until the fraudulent paperwork was permanently locked into the county registry. He thought putting me at the outcast table would make me feel small and powerless. He thought the heavy weight of social rejection would force me into total submission. But as I sat there gripping the edge of the table, the lingering sting of humiliation completely evaporated. It was instantly replaced by a cold, highly lethal surge of pure adrenaline. He had not just insulted me. He had committed a major felony, and he had stupidly invited a professional financial fraud investigator directly into the center of his own crime scene. The battle had officially begun. The heavy porcelain plates were being cleared away by the silent catering staff. A subtle shift in the ambient noise indicated the evening was transitioning toward the obligatory champagne toasts. I remained seated in my shadowy corner. I watched the most powerful man in the room begin his deliberate circuit around the tables. Senator Adrian Mercer moved with the effortless grace of a man who had spent 3 decades navigating treacherous political waters. He shook hands, offered warm smiles, and patted shoulders. He was the perfect host. As he approached the outer perimeter of the dining hall, his path brought him directly past table 44. He glanced down, offering the standard polite nod he gave to all the peripheral guests. But then his eyes locked onto my face. The polished political smile vanished from his features for a fraction of a second. He recognized me instantly. 4 years ago, I sat across from him in a highly classified ethics committee hearing deep inside a federal building. I was the primary forensic witness brought in to dissect a massive reconstruction fund fraud. My detailed testimony provided him with the exact financial blueprints he needed to sever a highly toxic network of corrupt defense contractors who had infiltrated his legislative districts. I gave him the ammunition to clean his own house. He knew my mind. He knew my unwavering adherence to the cold truth. A lesser man, a politician eager to show off his connection to a brilliant investigator, might have loudly called out my name. He might have drawn the attention of the entire room to my table, but Adrian Mercer did not survive in Washington by being careless. He looked at my entirely plain black dress. He looked at my isolated seat by the kitchen doors. He saw the cold and unyielding tension radiating from my posture. He instantly calculated the massive discrepancy between my professional caliber and my current humiliating placement at his future son-in-law's celebration. He knew immediately that something was violently wrong. He stepped closer to my chair and leaned down. His voice was a low and perfectly measured baritone, completely inaudible to anyone else at the table. He said it was a surprise to see me here. He did not ask why I was hiding. Instead, he smoothly fabricated a reason for us to speak privately. He told me he was reviewing a legislative file related to our previous collaboration and would greatly appreciate my sharp perspective for just a few moments. He instructed me to wait exactly 5 minutes and then make my way to his private library in the east wing of the estate. He straightened his posture, offered a charming smile to the elderly aunt sitting next to me, and smoothly continued his rounds. I waited exactly 300 seconds. I slipped out of my chair and navigated the quiet, dimly lit hallways until I found the heavy oak doors of the library. I stepped inside and closed the doors firmly behind me. The thick wood instantly severed the loud music and the echoing laughter of the ballroom. The room smelled of aged leather, rare books, and single malt scotch. It was a room designed for dangerous secrets. Senator Mercer was standing behind a massive mahogany desk. The genial host was completely gone. He looked at me with the sharp, predatory focus of a veteran lawmaker. He asked me directly what I was doing at his daughter's engagement dinner, sitting at the worst table in the house. I did not waste his time with pleasantries or soft introductions. I told him the unvarnished truth. I stated that the man standing by his daughter's side, the man he was preparing to welcome into his powerful family, was my brother. I watched the shock register in the senator's eyes, quickly followed by a dark and furious comprehension. He realized instantly that Owen had deliberately concealed my existence. But I did not stop there. I told him that an hour ago I had uncovered a massive financial crime unfolding under his own roof. I explained that a major political donor standing out in his ballroom was actively preparing to swallow a highly valuable commercial property co-owned by my family. I told him this donor was using completely fraudulent transfer documents and forged digital signatures to seize the land. And I looked the senator dead in the eye and told him that my brother Owen Castillo was the inside man facilitating the entire illegal transaction. Mercer gripped the edge of his desk. He asked me for the name of the donor. I said the name clearly, Silas Kincaid. The color drained completely from the senator's face. The silence in the library became heavy and suffocating. Mercer turned away and paced toward the tall bookshelves. He spoke in a low, tight voice. He revealed that his senior political advisors had explicitly warned him for months to keep a massive distance from Kincaid. The developer was considered radioactive, surrounded by endless rumors of displaced communities and aggressive corporate bullying. Mercer confessed that he had tried to freeze Kincaid out of his inner circle. But just 2 weeks ago, Owen had personally brought Kincaid back into the fold. Owen had vouched for him aggressively, introducing the developer as a clean, highly ethical partner for a new community housing initiative the senator was planning to launch next month. The trap my brother had built was suddenly illuminated in brilliant, terrifying detail. Owen was using the pristine reputation of the Mercer political dynasty to wash Silas Kincaid dirty money, and in exchange for delivering the senator endorsement, Kincaid was rewarding Owen with my stolen inheritance. If this deal went public, the scandal would not just destroy my brother. It would completely obliterate the Mercer family name and end the senator career. Mercer turned back to face me. His jaw was clenched tight. He reached for the heavy brass handle of the library door. He stated he was going to walk out there, halt the champagne toasts, and throw both of those criminals off his property immediately. I stepped directly into his path and blocked the door. I told him he absolutely could not do that tonight. My voice was calm, but completely unyielding. I explained that if he caused a public scene right now, Kincaid and my brother would realize they were caught. They would immediately panic. Within 1 hour, they would completely scrub their corporate servers. They would destroy the metadata connecting the forged signatures, incinerate the legal drafts, and bury the money trail so deep I would never be able to dig it out. They would deny everything, and the senator would be left with a massive public relations disaster and zero hard evidence. I looked at him and demanded time. I told him I needed exactly 1 week. I needed a few more days to quietly connect the final pieces of the financial chain and secure the undeniable proof required to send them both to federal prison. I promised him that if he held his temper tonight, I would hand him the weapon he needed to execute a florless amputation. Mercer stared at me for a long time. The anger in his eyes slowly transformed into a cold, profound respect. He recognized the strategy. It was exactly how I had dismantled the corrupt contractors 4 years ago. I did not strike until the kill was absolutely guaranteed. He released the brass door handle and took a slow, deep breath. He nodded his head once in agreement. He walked over to his private telephone and dialed a highly secure internal extension. He spoke 2 words into the receiver. He asked for me, Sloan. Less than 2 minutes later, a hidden side door in the library opened. A tall woman with sharply cut gray hair and an impeccably tailored navy suit walked into the room. Mira Sloan was a legendary figure in Washington. She was the chief ethics counsel and the ruthless protector of the Mercer family empire. She was the woman who buried scandals before they even breached the surface. Mercer did not need to introduce me. Mira looked at me, her eyes scanning my face with analytical precision. The senator briefed her rapidly, stripping the situation down to the raw facts. He told her about my brother, the hidden family connection, the forged land documents, and the catastrophic alliance with Silas Kincaid. Mira did not gasp or express outrage. She simply pulled a small leather-bound notebook from her pocket. She looked at me and asked what specific digital assets I needed frozen to secure my investigation. In that exact moment, the fundamental reality of the entire evening shifted completely. Out in the grand ballroom, the crystal glasses were clinking loudly. The hired photographers were capturing brilliant smiles. My brother was standing at the absolute center of the room, raising a glass of expensive champagne, believing he had successfully conquered the world and buried his past forever. He had absolutely no idea that the ground beneath his feet had just turned to ash. He did not know that his perfect engagement dinner had just been quietly transformed into a highly coordinated, extremely lethal financial audit. And he certainly did not know that the sister he banished to the shadows was now actively directing the executioners. The morning after the extravagant dinner party, the real work began. Mira Sloan did not waste a single second of daylight. We met inside a highly secured and soundproofed conference room at the Calder-Rowan Advisory headquarters. The massive room smelled sharply of dark roasted coffee and the faint ozone generated by high-speed document scanners. We completely bypassed the slow public county registry portals. We dug directly into the raw and unfiltered data streams of the state property filings. It took us exactly 4 hours of relentless searching to find the poisonous document. A formal purchase option agreement had been quietly lodged against the Prince George County commercial lot. It was officially filed under the name of a highly obscure corporate holding group. Mira used her extensive federal contacts to cross-reference the corporate registration numbers. We peeled back the layers of deception. The holding group traced back through 3 different offshore shell companies directly to the primary operations desk of Silas Kincaid. I pulled up the digitized image of the purchase option on the main projector screen. There it was resting innocently at the bottom of the final page. My personal signature looked absolutely flawless to the naked eye. The pressure curves and the subtle ink drag were perfectly replicated. But I do not rely on the naked eye. I ran the digital file through our proprietary forensic authentication software. Within 10 seconds, the entire digital architecture of the lie collapsed. The embedded metadata proof the signature was lifted directly from an old electronic tax return file I had emailed my brother exactly 14 months ago. It was a brilliant and utterly desperate forgery. But Mira found something else, buried deep within the financial background check. It was a massive anomaly attached directly to my parents. I stared blankly at the glowing monitor as the horrifying truth materialized in cold and undeniable black and white data. Exactly 6 months ago, my mother and father had quietly taken out a massive second mortgage on their small suburban home. The funds from that crippling loan were immediately transferred to a corporate account to cover a catastrophic deficit in one of Owen's private investment portfolios at Belmont Strategy Partners. He had recklessly gambled their entire financial security on a terrible deal and lost everything. My parents were completely bankrupt. They were currently drowning in massive debt they could never hope to repay in their lifetime. That was exactly why my mother had cornered me at the dinner table. They were not just blinded by my brother's social ambition. They were entirely dependent on his criminal land transaction to save them from losing their home and living on the street. 2 days later, my mobile phone vibrated with a secure text message from an unknown number. It was Charlotte Mercer. She asked to meet me privately at a small and very quiet coffee shop located in the historic district of Georgetown. I arrived exactly 15 minutes early, wearing my standard gray business suit. Charlotte walked through the door looking profoundly exhausted. The polished and radiant bride from the dinner party was completely gone. She sat across the small wooden table from me and ordered a simple black tea. She looked at me with those sharp and highly intelligent eyes. She confessed that for the first 6 months of their romantic relationship, Owen had sworn on his life that he was an only child. He claimed his parents were simple, hard-working people who had poured every single ounce of their energy into raising their one successful son. It was only when they started drafting the official wedding guest list that he casually amended his fictional history. He told her he actually had a sister, but we were completely arranged. He painted me as a deeply unstable, bitter, and highly impulsive woman who absolutely could not be trusted in polite society. I let her speak. I kept my face perfectly neutral and did not interrupt her narrative. Then Charlotte delivered a piece of information that made the entire coffee shop feel completely devoid of oxygen. She told me that she had accidentally overheard a private telephone call between Owen and Silas Kincaid just 3 days before the engagement dinner. Owen had explicitly promised the corrupt developer that the moment the engagement was publicly announced, Kincaid would have complete and unrestricted access to the commercial lot. Owen had proudly bragged that the Mercer political machine would easily steamroll any minor zoning issues or environmental reviews the city might try to impose. The final pieces of the complicated puzzle slammed into place with a deafening roar in my mind. My brother was not merely embarrassed by my lack of wealth or my blunt personality. He was absolutely terrified of my legal existence. He needed to systematically erase me from the family narrative, because if Charlotte or her highly powerful father ever discovered I was an equal co-owner of that valuable property, they would instantly demand a rigorous legal review. The entire corrupt deal would freeze immediately. He had to keep me completely hidden in the shadows until the fraudulent property transfer was permanently recorded and the illicit money was securely hidden in his offshore bank accounts. I returned to my quiet apartment later that evening. I opened a small locked metal box stored under my bed. I pulled out my personal copy of the original inheritance documents. My grandmother, Marisol, had kept the master copies inside a heavy iron safe located in her old bedroom. The only two people who possessed the physical combination to that secure safe were my grandmother and my mother. I realized with a sudden and sickening jolt how Owen had obtained the specific parcel numbers and the original deed drafts required to forge the new contracts. My mother had given him the keys to the kingdom. Elir Castillo, the woman who had always chosen the golden child over the difficult daughter, had willingly unlocked the iron safe. She had personally handed him the very tools he needed to steal my future. I sat alone on the edge of my bed. The apartment was completely silent except for the sound of my own breathing. For 36 years, I had always waited for my family to explain themselves. I had waited patiently for apologies that never arrived. I had constantly tried to understand their twisted motivations and forgive their countless daily betrayals. I had always assumed they were just weak people making poor choices. But sitting there in the dark room, holding the physical proof of their ultimate treachery, something inside me completely fractured and then solidified into pure, unbreakable steel. I was no longer the insulted little sister crying over a ruined dinner party or a stolen seat at a table. I was no longer waiting for a pathetic explanation from people who viewed me as nothing more than disposable financial collateral. I carefully placed the original documents into a thick manila folder. I methodically added the forensic metadata report, the hidden mortgage records, and the corporate shell company traces. I was officially done being the quiet and obedient family secret. I had gathered all the ammunition I needed. I was fully prepared to become their absolute destruction. I picked up my mobile phone and composed a very brief text message to my brother. The words tasted like ash in my mouth, but they were entirely necessary. I typed out a carefully constructed surrender. I told Owen that I had thought about our conversation at the dinner party and decided I did not want to ruin his happiness. I assured him I would stay completely out of his way and keep my mouth firmly shut regarding the commercial property. I pressed send and tossed the device onto my sofa. I knew exactly how he would react. He would read those sentences, exhale a massive breath of relief, and mistakenly believe that the overwhelming pressure of the Mercer wealth had successfully intimidated his younger sister into permanent silence. He thought I was beaten. That was his fatal mistake. Power does not announce itself with loud threats or temper tantrums. True power is absolute restraint. First thing Monday morning, I walked into the secure legal department of Calder Rowan Advisory. I did not ask for a favor. I cashed in every single professional chip I had earned over the past 10 years of relentless corporate auditing. I handed the encrypted drive containing the forged digital documents to our senior cyber forensics team. I gave them a very specific mandate. I did not just want to know that the signature was a fake. I wanted the undeniable architectural blueprint of the crime. For 3 straight days, we meticulously mapped the digital footprint of the document. We cross-referenced internet protocol addresses and matched the exact server timestamps of the file creation. We tracked the routing data from my brother's private office network directly to the legal servers utilized by Silas Kincaid. We built a flawless, ironclad chain of evidence that proved beyond a shadow of a doubt exactly when, where, and how Owen had stolen my identity to execute the transfer. While my team fortified the technical evidence, Mira Sloan was moving silently through the corridors of Washington. She operated like a ghost within the Mercer political infrastructure. Without ever issuing a formal press release or raising a single alarm within the aggressive donor network, Mira executed a complete administrative freeze on the community housing initiative. She effectively severed any immediate financial commitments tying Senator Mercer to the fraudulent development project. If Silas Kincaid or my brother asked any questions, they were met with polite bureaucratic excuses about standard compliance reviews and temporary legislative delays. Mira kept the beast completely caged and blind, preventing Kincaid from securing the political leverage he needed to finalize the land acquisition. But I needed one more piece of ammunition. I needed a weapon that Owen could never anticipate. I took a half-day off from work and drove out to a dusty, unremarkable legal office located in the older section of Alexandria. I sat down, with an elderly attorney who had handled my grandmother Marisol's modest estate planning decades ago. I asked him to dig deep into the physical archives, far past the standard will that Owen and my mother had selectively read. The old lawyer pulled a crumbling yellowed file from a rusted filing cabinet and handed me a certified copy of a highly specific legal addendum. It was a protective codicil my grandmother had drafted just 2 years before she passed away. Marisol Castillo had been a very shrewd woman who understood the dark complexities of human greed perfectly. The clause was explicitly clear. It stated that if one of her designated heirs ever attempted to defraud the other or engaged in any deceptive practices to illegally seize the shared inheritance, the perpetrator would be immediately stripped of their administrative rights. Complete and total executive control of the property would automatically default to the victimized party until a civil court reached a final verdict. Reading those typed words, a profound sense of peace washed over me. My brother thought he had outsmarted me with digital forgeries and wealthy friends. He had absolutely no idea that our grandmother had built a legal trapdoor into the very foundation of the deed, and he had just willingly stepped onto it himself. Throughout the week, Owen continued to play his role flawlessly. He paraded around the city in his expensive suits, acting the part of the triumphant, self-made man who had finally secured his ultimate prize. What he did not know was that the woman standing beside him was no longer a willing participant in his fairy tale. Charlotte Mercer had not broken off the engagement. Instead, she had made a much more dangerous choice. She had decided to stay and observe him closely. She wanted to see exactly how far he would push his lies. She watched him smile for the cameras. She listened to him speak passionately about family values. And she noted every single empty promise he made while believing he was completely invincible. She was calculating the exact weight of his deception. On Thursday evening, my mobile phone rang. It was my mother. My father was on the other end of the line as well, breathing heavily into the speakerphone. They did not call to apologize for mortgaging their house or for handing over the keys to my inheritance. They called to beg for a peaceful surrender. Their voices were frantic and entirely pathetic. They pleaded with me not to make a big deal out of the property transfer. They promised me that everything would be completely fine after the wedding took place. They swore that once Owen was officially part of the Mercer family, he would find a way to quietly compensate me for my share of the land. Listening to their desperate rationalizations, I felt nothing but a cold, hollow pity. They were not asking for justice. They were the kind of people who were perfectly willing to live inside a rotting house as long as the exterior paint looked expensive to the neighbors. They just wanted the superficial illusion of our family to remain unbroken. They wanted me to absorb the pain quietly so they would not have to face the terrifying consequences of their own cowardice. I did not yell at them. I did not curse or demand an apology they were incapable of giving. I kept my voice perfectly smooth and compliant. I told them they had absolutely nothing to worry about. I promised them I would not cause any embarrassing scenes in the shadows. I hung up the phone and made my final decision. Fighting them behind closed doors would achieve absolutely nothing. They would just continue to deny, deflect, and gaslight me. If I was going to tear down the fraudulent empire my brother had built, I was not going to do it in a quiet living room. I was going to drag the ugly, unvarnished truth out into the blinding spotlight. I was going to execute my response in the exact arena where Owen valued his reputation the most. A few hours later, a courier arrived at my apartment door holding a thick envelope embossed with the Mercer family crest. It was a formal invitation to the Foundation annual charity gala scheduled for the following weekend. This was the exact event where my brother was scheduled to take the stage. He was going to stand in front of hundreds of wealthy donors and powerful politicians to publicly announce his prestigious new role as the lead director of the Community Housing Initiative. He was going to permanently cement his corrupt alliance with Silas Kincaid under the guise of noble public service. I pulled a high-quality black ink pen from my desk drawer. I checked the box marked attending on the heavy cardstock response card. I sealed the envelope carefully and handed it back to the waiting courier. I was not going to hide at a secondary table near the kitchen ever again. I was going to walk directly through the front doors of that gala armed with irrefutable metadata a secret legal courting of the most powerful political family in the state. Owen Castillo had spent his entire life trying to craft the perfect public image. Next weekend, I was going to ensure he got exactly the audience he deserved to watch it all burn to the ground. The grand ballroom of the downtown Plaza Hotel was a blinding display of excessive wealth and entrenched political influence. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a brilliant, fractured light over hundreds of Washington elite. I walked through the main double doors, wearing a sharply tailored, completely unadorned navy blue suit. I carried a sleek leather briefcase in my right hand instead of a decorative evening clutch. A senior event hostess approached me with a master seating chart. I fully expected to be directed to another dark, humiliating corner near the catering kitchen doors. Instead, she offered a polite, practiced smile and escorted me directly into the absolute center of the cavernous room. She pulled out a chair at table number 1, the primary VIP table. My brother was already seated across the large circular table, engaged in a lively, animated conversation with a prominent state judge. When he saw me calmly sit down across from him, his sentence died instantly in his throat. The color drained rapidly from his perfectly tanned face, leaving him looking sickly and pale. He tightly gripped the edge of the white linen tablecloth, his knuckles turning completely white under the strain. He shot a frantic, venomous glare in my direction, silently demanding to know how I had breached his strict security perimeter. Charlotte Mercer sat gracefully exactly 2 seats away from him. She caught my eye across the floral centerpiece and offered a microscopic, highly deliberate nod. She was the architect of this track. She had personally overridden the event planners and rearranged the seating chart. She had dragged the inconvenient family ghost out of the shadows and placed me directly beneath the brightest, most unforgiving lights in the room. Owen was practically vibrating with barely contained panic, but he was completely trapped by the sheer social weight of his immediate audience. He could not throw a tantrum. He could not order security to remove me. He could only sit there, smile tightly, and sweat. A few minutes later, Sealers Kincaid arrived at the table. He moved with the arrogant swagger of a man who believed he owned the entire building. He carried a thick, glossy presentation, portfolio bound in expensive dark leather. He slammed it down on the table with a triumphant thud. He immediately began pitching his new development project to the surrounding politicians, utilizing a vocabulary that made my stomach physically turn. He called his project a noble sanctuary for displaced community veterans. He spoke passionately about urban healing and deep moral obligations. It was a flawless, highly polished public relations shield entirely designed to hide the brutal reality of his predatory land speculation and massive municipal tax evasion. When the extravagant dinner service finally concluded, the ambient noise in the room quieted down. Senator Adrian Mercer stepped up to the main stage and proudly introduced my brother to the crowd. Owen walked up to the wooden podium, looking every single inch the rising, brilliant political star. He adjusted the microphone and delivered a rousing speech that was entirely constructed from stolen virtues and fabricated history. He spoke eloquently about the paramount importance of radical honesty. He praised the unwavering sacred strength of family bonds. He solemnly promised to dedicate the rest of his professional life to serving the underprivileged communities of our state. Every single syllable echoing through the massive ballroom was built entirely on the foundation of my stolen inheritance and our parents' absolute financial ruin. I sat perfectly still, listening to the thunderous applause when he finally finished. He returned to our table, his face heavily flushed with the intoxicating adrenaline of absolute victory. He genuinely thought he had successfully crossed the finish line. The surrounding guests raised their crystal champagne flutes to toast his newly announced role as the lead corporate director of the Veteran Housing Initiative. I did not raise my glass. I waited patiently for the applause to fade and the noise to settle into a quiet, intimate hum around our specific table. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the table. I looked directly into my brother's eyes and asked a single, incredibly simple question. I asked him to tell the table exactly who had signed the legal purchase option for the Castile lot to secure this specific housing project. My voice was not loud, but the sheer bluntness of the highly technical inquiry sliced through the polite congratulatory atmosphere like a surgical scalpel. The ambient chatter around our immediate section of the table died out instantly. Senator Mercer slowly lowered his champagne glass, his expression turning entirely unreadable. Silas Kincaid froze mid-sip, his eyes darting aggressively toward me. Owen let out a smooth practice chuckle. It was a highly calculated sound explicitly designed to make my serious question seem trivial, confusing, and completely out of place at a festive gathering. He waved his hand dismissively and loudly told the surrounding guests that it was merely a boring administrative detail. He confidently stated that all property ownership rights had been fully unified and settled within our family trust many months ago. He desperately expected that smooth lie to end the conversation permanently. He was entirely wrong. Charlotte Mercer placed her linen napkin onto the table with slow, deliberate precision. She did not look at Owen. She looked directly at Silas Kincaid. She stated in a cold, ringing voice that she had personally requested a strict, indefinite hold on any public financial announcements regarding the housing initiative. She told the entire table she absolutely refused to associate the Mercer Family Foundation with any physical asset that had not passed a rigorous independent forensic audit to ensure a perfectly clean chain of title. The atmospheric pressure at table number 1 plummeted instantly. The unspoken implication hung incredibly heavy in the air. The radiant bride-to-be had just publicly called the structural and legal integrity of the flagship project into absolute question. Senator Mercer turned his head slowly. He fixed Silas Kincaid with a stare so intensely lethal it could have cut through solid steel. At the far end of the table, Mira Sloane quietly adjusted her silver wire-rimmed glasses. She leaned forward and politely offered to review the entire land portfolio right there on the spot, explicitly to clear up any unfortunate misunderstandings before the press released their morning articles. Sealers let out a harsh, barking laugh, desperately trying to re-establish a jovial, casual tone. He loudly insisted it was neither the time nor the place to review tedious legal paperwork, but his performance failed miserably. His large tan hand was gripping the delicate stem of his wine glass, so tightly the crystal looked ready to shatter into 100 sharp pieces. He was a trapped predator, suddenly realizing all the exits were locked. Owen realized with mounting horror that the entire foundation of his elaborate scam was actively cracking wide open, right in front of his elite audience. In a desperate, frantic bid to survive, he chose to viciously attack the messenger. He leaned across the table, his face twisting into an ugly mask of condescending pity. He loudly asked the surrounding guests to please forgive his younger sister. He boldly claimed I had always struggled with intense, irrational professional jealousy regarding his massive corporate success. He utilized the exact same poisonous words he had fed Charlotte for months. He declared I was highly unstable, prone to exaggerating minor, familial issues, and completely incapable of understanding complex corporate transactions. He was aggressively trying to paint me as a hysterical, bitter woman trying to ruin his special night out of pure, unadulterated spite. Charlotte did not even blink. She turned her dark, intelligent eyes onto the man she was supposed to marry. Her voice was utterly devoid of any human warmth. She asked him a single devastating question. She asked why, if I was so deeply unstable and confused, I was the only person sitting at this table currently resting my hand on a briefcase full of certified legal documents while he and his billionaire partner were sweating profusely and making wild, unsubstantiated excuses. A terrifying, suffocating silence completely enveloped the space around us. The surrounding tables in the ballroom were still laughing and drinking, entirely unaware of the brutal execution taking place in the exact center of the room. Owen opened his mouth to formulate a defensive response, but absolutely no words came out. His polished, expensive facade completely shattered, fully revealing the terrified, cornered fraud underneath. Senator Mercer did not raise his voice. He did not flip the table or cause a loud public spectacle that would inevitably end up on the morning news broadcasts. He was a veteran master of controlled, devastating demolition. He leaned in incredibly close, ensuring his words were meant only for the specific people involved in the transaction. He rigidly commanded my brother Sealers Kincaid and me to be present in the Mercer family private corporate boardroom at exactly 8:00 tomorrow morning. He stated clearly and unequivocally that absolutely no outside defense lawyers and no public relations managers were allowed to attend the meeting. Mercer stood up gracefully, buttoned his tailored suit jacket, and offered a warm, polite smile to a passing dona as if absolutely nothing was wrong. Charlotte stood up immediately after her father and walked away without looking back at Owen even once. My brother sat completely frozen in his chair. The blood had entirely left his face. He stared blankly at his empty porcelain plate. He finally understood that the sudden change in the seating arrangement was the absolute least of his problems. The question I had asked was not a random emotional outburst of sibling jealousy. It was the deliberate ignition of a highly calculated explosive fuse. Tomorrow morning was not going to be a simple business meeting or a polite family negotiation. It was going to be a ruthless closed-door tribunal, and he finally realized he was walking into it entirely defenseless, about to watch the prestigious life he had stolen completely burned to the ground. It was exactly 11:45 when the violent pounding on my apartment door started. I had just finished organizing my legal files and forensic reports into a sleek black leather briefcase for the morning tribunal. The sudden aggressive noise shattered the quiet sanctuary of my home. I walked slowly to the door and looked through the small glass peephole. Standing in the dimly lit hallway were my brother, my mother, and my father. They did not look like the proud, arrogant family who had toasted to high society just a few hours prior. They looked entirely frantic. I unbolted the heavy lock and pulled the door open, stepping back to let them inside. They pushed into my cramped living room without a single word of greeting. The physical space instantly felt suffocating. The air grew incredibly thick and heavy, charged with a desperate, toxic energy. They did not sit down on the sofa or take off their coats. They stood tightly grouped together in the center of the room, forming a pathetic and terrified united front against me. Owen did not waste any time attempting to play the noble, misunderstood sibling. The polished, charismatic orator from the extravagant Garler was completely dead and gone. In his place stood a cornered, sweating man whose entire fabricated universe was actively collapsing around him. His expensive custom suit looked suddenly wrinkled and poorly fitted. He reached into his leather bag with trembling hands and pulled out a thick stack of freshly printed legal documents. He threw them aggressively onto my glass coffee table. He loudly demanded I look at the paperwork. He rapidly explained it was an airtight, ironclad non-disclosure agreement paired with a comprehensive legal waiver surrendering all my rightful claims to our grandmother inheritance. Pinned to the front of the legal stack was a certified bank check made out to me for $250,000. It was a miserable, insulting bribe. He ordered me to sign the bottom line immediately, take the money, and completely disappear from his life before the sun came up tomorrow morning. When I refused to even look at the check, my brother completely dropped his mask. The terrifying reality of his impending destruction finally shattered his ego. He frantically confessed the absolute truth. He told me that if I walked into the Mercer corporate boardroom tomorrow and exposed his fraudulent land transfer, he would lose absolutely everything. He admitted that Belmont Strategy Partners would immediately terminate his employment and likely press massive corporate fraud charges against him. He confessed that Senator Mercer would utterly obliterate his professional reputation across the entire eastern seaboard, making it physically impossible for him to ever work in finance or politics again. And most devastatingly, he admitted that the massive corporate debt he had secretly hidden would instantly default, which would completely seize our parents' house and leave them entirely homeless. He was no longer trying to protect his pride. He was actively begging for his absolute survival. Right at that moment, my mother broke down into loud, heavy sobs. She stepped forward and tightly grabbed my wrists. Her manicured fingernails dug painfully into my skin, but as I looked deeply into her red, tear-filled eyes, the absolute darkest realization of my life washed over me. She was not crying out of maternal guilt. She was not shedding a single tear for the massive betrayal her only daughter had endured. She was weeping entirely because the glorious wealthy future she had always envisioned for her golden son was rapidly disintegrating into dust. She practically choked on her own tears as she begged me to just sign the documents. She hysterically accused me of ruining his one chance at a proper dignified life. She demanded I sacrifice my future, my inheritance, and my self-respect one final time to maintain the fragile illusion of our family success. Then, the most sickening blow of the entire night came from the quietest person in the room. My father stared at the hardwood floor and finally spoke. His voice trembled with a pathetic, deeply ingrained cowardice. He quietly confessed that exactly 14 months ago, during a brief weekend visit to my apartment, he had personally walked into my home office. He admitted he had explicitly seen Owen sitting at my desk, actively using my private laptop while I was completely unaware in the kitchen. My father knew Owen was doing something highly suspicious. He knew my brother had absolutely no right to dig through my secure digital files, but my father had chosen to quietly close the door and walk away. He looked up at me with weak, hollow eyes and muttered that he thought I would eventually forgive Owen anyway because we were family. My own father had actively witnessed the theft of my digital identity and chose absolute silence to preserve the household peace. The sheer weight of their collective betrayal threatened to pull all the oxygen from the room, but I kept my posture perfectly rigid. I did not shed a single tear. Sensing my unwavering, absolute refusal, Owen resorted to his lowest and most vile tactic. He reached back into his bag and pulled out a single, heavily redacted sheet of paper. He waved it aggressively inches from my face. He venomously threatened that if I did not sign the waiver right now, he would electronically distribute that anonymous, highly damaging dossier to the senior executive board at Calder Rowan Advisory. He claimed the file contained a severe ethical complaint regarding my professional conduct. He boldly stated he would completely destroy my career, my reputation, and my livelihood if I dared to expose his crimes to the Mercer family. He fully revealed the dark, rotten core of his soul. He was a man completely willing to aggressively destroy anyone, even his own flesh and blood, just to keep his head above the water. I stood completely still and let the suffocating silence stretch out for a long, heavy moment. I let them exhaust all their desperate threats and pathetic pleas. Then I calmly walked over to my kitchen counter. I reached behind the coffee maker and picked up my small digital audio recorder. I pressed the stop button. The sharp mechanical click echoed loudly in the quiet room. I turned around and faced my completely stunned family. I informed them in a cold, flat voice that the device had been running since the exact second I opened the front door. I had recorded every single syllable of their desperate extortion attempt, their admission of guilt, and their vile blackmail threats. I watched the blood instantly drain from my mother's face. My father took a stumbling step backward, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. I shifted my gaze directly to my brother. I coldly dissected his pathetic blackmail attempt. I informed him that the supposed ethical complaint he was holding was a highly documented retaliatory smear campaign fabricated 3 years ago by a corrupt logistics company, a company that was entirely funded by Silas Kincaid. I told Owen that my firm had thoroughly investigated the completely baseless claims and completely exonerated me within a week. The document he thought was a lethal weapon was entirely worthless. It was nothing more than recycled garbage. The profound shock completely silenced my parents. They stood completely frozen in my living room, staring at me as if I were a terrifying, dangerous stranger they had never met before. And for the very first time in his entire arrogant life, my brother truly looked at me. He did not see the quiet, obedient younger sister who would constantly absorb the blame and fix his mistakes. He did not see the convenient stepping stone he could effortlessly crush under his expensive leather shoes. He saw a highly calculated, entirely ruthless adversary who had successfully outmaneuvered him on every single front. The comfortable, enabling family dynamic he had exploited for 36 years was permanently dead and buried. I walked over to the front door and pulled it wide open. The cold, crisp air from the hallway rushed into the suffocating apartment. I looked directly into my brother's completely defeated eyes and delivered the absolute, coldest truth of the entire night. I told him I was not maliciously attempting to destroy his life. I stated clearly that he had actively chosen to completely destroy his own life the exact moment he decided to invite me to that dinner party. I told him his fatal mistake was not just the forged signature or the stolen land. His absolute greatest failure was deciding I was entirely unworthy of existing in his world with my own true name. I pointed toward the empty hallway and firmly ordered them to get out of my home. At exactly 8 in the morning, I walked through the heavy mahogany doors of the Mercer family private corporate boardroom. I did not enter through a service elevator. I did not wear a plain dress designed to make me invisible. I walked into the room wearing a sharply tailored charcoal suit, my posture perfectly straight, carrying a thick leather briefcase in my right hand. I was no longer the inconvenient guest forced into the shadows. I was the legal co-owner of the property in question, and I was the singular person holding the entire chain of undeniable evidence. The atmosphere inside the massive room was freezing cold and entirely devoid of the celebratory warmth from the night before. Senator Adrian Mercer sat at the absolute head of the long wooden table. Charlotte Mercer sat to his immediate right, her beautiful face transformed into an unreadable mask of carved marble. Mira Sloane stood quietly in the corner, her arms crossed tight against her chest. Across the wide table sat Sealers Kincaid, my brother Owen, and my parents. They looked exactly like terrified prisoners waiting for a firing squad to assemble. I did not wait for an invitation to take a seat. I walked directly to the center of the room and placed my briefcase flat on the polished wood. The sharp metallic click of the latches opening echoed loudly against the silent walls. I pulled out 4 separate thick file folders and placed them precisely in a row directly in front of Senator Mercer. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with absolute clinical precision. I opened the first folder and presented the digital audio transcript from the night before detailing every single pathetic threat and blackmail attempt my family had made in my living room. I opened the second folder and laid out the comprehensive metadata analysis, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that the digital signature on the land purchase option was a complete forgery executed from my brother's private network. I opened the third folder and presented the certified legal addendum from grandmother Marisol, clearly stating that any heir court committing fraud automatically forfeited all executive rights to the victimized party. Finally, I opened the fourth folder revealing the highly complex financial routing map that explicitly connected Silas Kincaid offshore holding companies directly to the massive deficit in my brother's corporate investment portfolio. Owen tried desperately to speak. His voice was a high, panicked stammer. He wildly attempted to spin the narrative, claiming he was only trying to protect the prestigious Mercer political image from our complicated working-class background. He swore he was doing it all to protect the senator. Senator Mercer slammed his hand flat against the table. The sudden violent noise made my parents physically jump in their chairs. Mercer looked at my brother with a level of pure disgust I had never seen before. He stated with absolute terrifying clarity that his family had never, not even once, requested that Owen hide my existence. Mercer told the entire room that he did not care if I was a financial investigator or a street sweeper. The entire elaborate story about the Mercer family demanding a pristine public image was a complete and utter fabrication. It was a filthy smoke screen Owen had invented entirely on his own to justify erasing me, all to ensure I never found out he was selling my inheritance to a corrupt developer. Charlotte Mercer stood up slowly from her chair. She did not scream. She did not shed a single tear or create a dramatic scene. She quietly slipped the massive diamond engagement ring off her left hand and placed it gently in the exact center of the table. Her voice was as sharp and cold as a razor blade. She looked directly at Owen and told him she absolutely could not marry a man who viewed the complete erasure of his own sister as an acceptable stepping stone for his career. She turned around and walked out of the boardroom without looking back a single time. Senator Mercer stood up next. He turned to his chief ethics counsel and issued rapid, devastating orders. He instructed Mira Sloane to immediately withdraw the foundation name from the Veteran Housing Initiative. He ordered her to forward my entire dossier of forensic evidence directly to the state civil enforcement and Ethics Division. Then he turned his lethal gaze toward Silas Kincaid. He told the corrupt billionaire that if he ever attempted to contact the Mercer family again, or if he ever stepped foot inside the state capitol, the senator would personally dedicate the rest of his political career to ensuring Kincaid spent his remaining years inside a federal prison cell. Kincaid grabbed his leather portfolio and rushed out of the room without saying a single word. At exactly 9 in the morning, the mobile phone sitting in front of Owen began to vibrate loudly. It was the senior managing partner at Belmont Strategy Partners. The devastating news had already breached the corporate walls through the extensive network of Mira Sloan. The executive informed Owen that he was suspended immediately, pending a massive internal investigation for utilizing company leverage to vouch for false information on a highly illegal personal real estate transaction. In less than 60 minutes, my brother had permanently lost his wealthy fiancée, his powerful political alliance, his prestigious corporate job, and the inheritance he had tried to steal. I turned my head and looked at my mother and father. They were sitting completely paralyzed in their heavy chairs. They could no longer hide behind their pathetic excuses about doing terrible things for the greater good of the family. The undeniable truth was staring them right in the face, and it was incredibly ugly. They had to face the sickening reality that they had willingly sold the trust, the loyalty, and the love of their only daughter. They had gambled their entire financial security on a vain, hollow social dream that had just burned to ashes right in front of their eyes. Several months later, the dust finally settled. I officially took over total executive control of the commercial property in Prince George County, exactly as my grandmother had intended in her protective legal clause. I completely refused to sell the land to any corporate speculators or greedy developers. Instead, after many weeks of rigorous vetting and careful planning, I signed a long-term partnership agreement with a highly transparent nonprofit community housing organization. We began developing the land into a beautiful, affordable residential complex that we officially named Marisol Commons. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, I found myself sitting at the head of a small, scratched wooden table inside a modest community center. It was the very first official signing ceremony for the new development project. There were no expensive crystal chandeliers. There was no cheap, tearful family reconciliation. There were no emotional hugs or fake apologies from the people who shared my blood. My parents and my brother were completely absent from my new life, and I felt incredibly deeply at peace. Sitting there in the warm sunlight, I felt the profound grounding reality that I had finally stopped asking other people for permission to exist on my own terms. My brother once truly believed that the most cruel thing he could ever do was force me to sit at a forgotten side table in the dark. But it turned out the absolute most stupid thing he ever did was let a woman who thoroughly understands complex legal documents, the dark depths of human nature, and the sheer devastating value of silence walk into the room and think she would remain quiet forever. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Please leave a comment and let me know where you are listening from so we can interact and share our thoughts together. I invite you to subscribe to the Azad Revenge Stories channel, like the video, and support me further by pressing the hype button so the story in this video can be heard by many more people. Thanks to all.